When a police officer stops a driver he deems suspicious, he has no idea that the man behind the wheel is actually Mayor Jackson Lewis. Driven by baseless biases, a routine traffic stop quickly escalates into a tense confrontation, exposing deep-seated issues within the police department and challenging how we perceive one another. What will happen when the officer discovers Jackson's true identity? And how will this incident impact the town of Cedarville? If you're ready to find out how this encounter unfolds and the changes Jackson will bring, make sure to wang. If you find this story intriguing, comment 1 below. And if you think it's powerful, drop a 2. As dusk began to settle over the city, Mayor Jackson Lewis was finally heading home after an exhausting day. The meetings, the tense budget discussions, the countless administrative tasks, it had been a relentless stream of demands. Eager for some respite, he was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. Driving through the mostly empty streets, Jackson tapped his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel, the comforting beat soothing his frayed nerves. Bookmark, go back. But just as he approached the quiet intersection of Maple and Oak, flashing red and blue lights burst into his rearview mirror, piercing the evening calm. His heart skipped a beat, but confusion quickly took over. He hadn't been speeding and hadn't broken any visible traffic laws. Yet, here he was, being pulled over. Remaining composed, Jackson cautiously steered his car to the side, coming to a safe stop. His mind raced with possible reasons for the stop, but none seemed to make sense. As the engine idled, he could see the officer's patrol car pulling up behind him, gravel crunching beneath its tires. A burly, stern-faced officer stepped out of the patrol car and approached with a confident, almost intimidating stride. Jackson couldn't place him, but the officer's rigid stance and piercing gaze unsettled him. He rolled down his window, his expression neutral, though inside his frustration grew. He knew his rights, but this encounter felt strange from the start. "Good evening, officer," Jackson greeted politely, his tone calm and level, despite the unease curling in his stomach. "Evening," the officer replied curtly, leaning into the window, eyes scanning Jackson with a skeptical, almost dismissive glance. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Jackson's brow furrowed slightly, his voice reflecting his genuine puzzlement. "No, officer, I wasn't aware I'd done anything wrong." The officer's gaze hardened, and he spoke with a tone that edged on condescending. "Well, I'll need to see your license and registration. Just a routine check," he added, though his body language spoke of anything but routine. There was a tension in the air, a barely concealed hostility that Jackson couldn't ignore. Suppressing a sigh, Jackson complied, retrieving his documents and handing them over. He reminded himself to stay calm, hoping that this interaction would end without further issues. But as he watched the officer's expression twist into something unreadable while he reviewed the documents, a sense of foreboding crept over him. The officer finally looked up, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You seem awfully at ease for someone driving a little close to the center line, wouldn't you say?" Jackson blinked, surprised by the accusation. He had been driving carefully, as he always did. "Officer, I've driven this route for years without any issue," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "I wasn't aware of crossing any line." The officer tapped the documents in his hand thoughtfully, his expression still unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he commanded suddenly. Jackson's pulse quickened. "Is that really necessary?" "I haven't broken any laws," he protested, though he kept his tone measured. "It's standard procedure," the officer replied brusquely, motioning for Jackson to step out. Feeling the weight of the situation, Jackson reluctantly unbuckled his seatbelt and exited the car, his heart racing as he stood on the side of the quiet street. A couple of passers-by glanced curiously in their direction, their expressions shifting from interest to concern as they took in the scene. The officer began a methodical search of Jackson's car, rifling through his belongings with a palpable sense of suspicion. Jackson watched from the curb, a swirl of frustration and helplessness building inside him. Despite his cooperation, it was clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary stop. Minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, as the officer continued his search, leaving Jackson to grapple with a growing sense of unease about the encounter and the hidden animosity fueling it. I will continue with Part 2 next, focusing on the escalation and wrongful detainment. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments along the way. Jackson's frustration grew as he watched the officer, who seemed intent on drawing out the search as long as possible. Each item was handled with excessive care. Each glance thrown Jackson's way filled with suspicion. It was as if the officer were stalling, waiting for something to justify this unprovoked stop. Finally, the officer straightened, closing the car door with a deliberate snap. "Well," he said with a slight smirk, "everything seems to be in order. But I'm still not entirely satisfied with the way you're handling this, so I'm going to run a background check." Jackson's patience was thinning. He tried to keep his tone respectful. "Officer, I'm not sure what's happening here, but I've complied with everything you've asked. Can I go home now?" The officer ignored him, still focused on whatever he was jotting down on his clipboard. "Just sit tight," he said, barely sparing Jackson a glance as he made his way back to the cruiser. Jackson clenched his jaw, watching the flashing lights reflect off the empty streets around him. The minutes crept by with agonizing slowness. Jackson was now standing in the chill of the evening air, shifting his weight as he tried to calm his rising anger. What should have been a brief drive home had turned into an ordeal with no clear end in sight. Each time he glanced back at the cruiser, he saw the officer, his face illuminated by the blue and red glow of the dashboard lights as he spoke into his radio. Jackson's thoughts spiraled. The absurdity of the situation gnawed at him. This wasn't just an inconvenient delay. It was an abuse of authority, one that weighed heavily on him. As mayor, he'd fought for the city and championed causes, and now, standing here under suspicion for no valid reason, he felt an anger far deeper than his own frustration. He felt a profound sense of injustice for his entire community. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer emerged from the cruiser, clutching a citation slip. His face was unreadable, but his eyes bore into Jackson with a defiant intensity. "Step over here," he ordered, holding out the clipboard with the ticket. Jackson approached, reading the ticket in disbelief. "A citation? For what? I haven't broken any laws." The officer's voice was flat, indifferent. "Your records show some discrepancies," he said, his tone tinged with something Jackson couldn't quite place, a calculated cruelty. "It's just a precaution." Jackson took a deep breath, struggling to keep his composure. "Discrepancies? What kind of discrepancies?" he asked, his voice taut with restrained frustration. Ignoring Jackson's question, the officer began scribbling on the clipboard again. The entire interaction felt surreal. Here he was, mayor of the city, being treated like a criminal without any explanation. His mind raced with questions, but the officer seemed set on prolonging this power play. As the officer tore the citation from his clipboard and thrust it toward Jackson, he muttered something under his breath, his tone barely concealing a simmering hostility. Jackson's eyes narrowed, catching just enough of the murmured words to realize they weren't meant to be friendly. But as he accepted the citation, Jackson made up his mind. He wouldn't let this go unaddressed. This wasn't just about him. He knew the community he served faced similar treatment every day, and he now felt a personal responsibility to expose and address these abuses of power. "Until you receive a court summons, you're free to go," the officer said dismissively, turning back to his cruiser without so much as a backward glance. Jackson felt the coldness of the evening air seep through his jacket as he made his way back to his car, the weight of the evening settling on his shoulders. As he sat in the driver's seat, he looked at the ticket, the words blurring as a mix of frustration and indignation washed over him. Starting the engine, Jackson drove away from the scene, his thoughts a whirl of emotion. He was done with being polite, done with keeping his head down. The officer's actions had opened his eyes to the systemic problems he'd only ever witnessed from a distance. He would face the city administration, the police department, and the community, all with a resolve to address this injustice. Jackson wasn't just determined to speak out, he was determined to bring meaningful change to Cedarville, and he wouldn't stop until the community had a police force it could trust. After the initial anger subsided, Jackson felt the gravity of what he'd experienced truly sink in. This incident wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a reflection of the treatment many in his community faced. His heart ached with frustration, but he knew this was far from over. Instead of going home, he made a sharp turn and headed straight for the Cedarville police precinct. As he arrived, the police station's fluorescent lights cast an unwelcoming glow against the night. Jackson took a deep breath before entering. He didn't know what he expected, but he was determined to get answers. As he approached the front desk, he felt a strange mix of apprehension and righteous anger. Inside, the atmosphere was bustling, phones ringing, officers moving through with files and papers, and a constant hum of activity. The woman at the reception desk looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw Jackson approach, still holding the citation. Before he could introduce himself, he heard a familiar, sharp voice behind him. "Well, look who decided to pay us a visit," came the voice of Officer Reynolds, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. Jackson turned slowly to see Reynolds standing there, arms crossed and expression unyielding. Despite recognizing Jackson's face, Reynolds didn't seem the least bit fazed. The frustration that had simmered in Jackson now boiled over. "Officer Reynolds, I demand an explanation. I complied with everything you asked, and yet I was treated like a criminal. This abuse of power is unacceptable." Reynolds smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Just doing my job, Mr. Lewis. You seemed a little too comfortable on the road, and I needed to ensure the city's safety," he replied, his tone sharp, as if challenging Jackson to protest further. Jackson squared his shoulders, his voice firm. "And did you bother to verify who I am? Because I can tell you that treating citizens this way is not how we serve and protect." Reynolds' face darkened, and before he could respond, a woman approached, Detective Linda Sawyer, a senior officer known for her integrity. She took in the scene with a quick, discerning glance. "What's going on here?" Jackson held out the citation. "This is what's going on. A baseless stop, a search without reason, and now a citation I don't deserve." Detective Sawyer's face softened as she listened, casting a cool glance toward Reynolds. She took the ticket from Jackson and scanned it, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Lewis, may I see your ID?" she asked, her tone respectful. Jackson handed over his ID, and Detective Sawyer's eyes widened slightly. She looked up, then back at Reynolds, who now shifted uncomfortably. The realization dawned on her, and a look of disapproval flashed across her face. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her voice low but steady, "we'll discuss your actions in my office. Mr. Lewis, please wait here while we sort this out." Without another word, Detective Sawyer guided Reynolds down a hallway, leaving Jackson standing alone. He glanced around at the nearby officers, some casting sympathetic looks, while others avoided his gaze entirely. It was clear the precinct was aware that something had gone wrong, but few were willing to step in. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, before Detective Sawyer returned, her expression apologetic yet professional. "Mr. Lewis, I want to formally apologize on behalf of the precinct. Officer Reynolds has been removed from duty pending investigation. This shouldn't have happened, and I will personally ensure it's addressed properly." Jackson nodded, taking a steadying breath. "Detective Sawyer, thank you. I appreciate your professionalism, but this isn't just about me. There are others in this community who don't have the platform I do, and they're treated this way regularly. This has to change." Detective Sawyer's expression softened as she nodded. "I understand, Mr. Lewis. We're working to address these issues, but I agree, there's much more work to be done. We'll look into this incident thoroughly, and if there's more to address, we'll pursue it." With a final handshake, Jackson left the precinct, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. As he stepped back into the night air, he felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and determination. He knew he'd be back at the precinct soon, but next time, it wouldn't be as a victim of bias and mistreatment. It would be as an advocate for justice and change. The calm Cedarville streets stretched ahead of him as he drove home. His quiet evening had been shattered, but in its place, a mission had formed, one he would dedicate himself to pursuing until every resident of Cedarville could feel safe, respected, and fairly treated. The following morning, Jackson's thoughts were already swirling with plans and strategies. The incident the night before had been a wake-up call, and he knew his position as mayor offered him a unique opportunity to spark change. Arriving at City Hall, he felt an unwavering sense of purpose settle over him as he made his way to his office. He was greeted by his assistant, Rachel, a dedicated professional in her mid-30s known for her keen sense of organization and genuine concern for the community. She immediately noticed his serious expression. "Good morning, Mayor Lewis," she said, handing him a stack of meeting notes. "Is everything all right?" Jackson set the notes aside and looked at her with a resolve that surprised even himself. "Rachel, I need to organize an emergency meeting with the City Council and Chief Bradley," he said firmly. "It's urgent." Rachel's eyebrows raised, but she didn't question him. "Absolutely. I'll reach out to them right away. Any particular agenda?" He nodded. "Yes. I want to discuss reforms within our police department, specifically regarding the kind of treatment I experienced last night." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was pulled over without cause, searched, and cited unfairly. And I'm not the only one who's faced this. It's time we take this seriously." Rachel's expression shifted, a spark of understanding and support flashing in her eyes. "I'll make it happen, Mayor. The community deserves to be heard." Within a few hours, Jackson was seated in the City Council's conference room, joined by Chief Bradley, members of the City Council, and a few key community leaders who had been invited to provide additional perspectives. The room buzzed with tension as people settled into their seats, many of them unsure of what to expect. As the meeting began, Jackson took a deep breath and rose to address the room, his gaze steady. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. Last night, I was subjected to a traffic stop that quickly escalated without justification. The officer's treatment of me was biased and inappropriate. If this can happen to the mayor, I can only imagine what others in our community are going through." Chief Bradley, a seasoned law enforcement officer with a reputation for calm authority, nodded, his face serious. "Mayor, I understand this must have been a difficult experience. We take all allegations seriously, and I've already placed the officer in question on suspension pending an internal review." Jackson nodded but continued. "I appreciate that, Chief, but we both know this isn't just about one officer. There's a deeper problem here. I'm calling for systemic reforms that will address bias within the department and rebuild trust with the community." The council members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Councilwoman Linda Ortiz, known for her advocacy on social justice issues, leaned forward. "Mayor Lewis is right. We've heard complaints from community members for years about unjust treatment, and it's time we take real action." Jackson felt a surge of gratitude toward her support. "Exactly. And I think we should start with several specific steps: enhanced bias training, a more transparent disciplinary process, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board to ensure accountability. We need to show our community that their voices matter." Chief Bradley took a moment before responding, his expression contemplative. "I agree that our officers need to be held to the highest standard. We've conducted training before, but if there's a need to expand and strengthen it, I'm open to exploring those options, and a civilian oversight board could add an additional layer of trust and transparency, though we'd need to define its responsibilities carefully." Jackson met his gaze, determination hardening his features. "I'm glad to hear that, Chief. We're not looking to weaken our police department. On the contrary, we want to strengthen it by building a force that respects and understands the people it serves. And that means addressing these issues head-on, with the community's involvement." Over the next hour, they discussed the logistics of implementing these changes. The council members debated the specifics of the oversight board, while Chief Bradley expressed concerns about resources for the new training. Jackson noted each issue, determined to address them, but unwilling to compromise on the need for real, impactful reform. By the end of the meeting, a preliminary plan had taken shape, one that included immediate steps toward increased training, a review of the current disciplinary procedures, and plans for a public forum to discuss the formation of the oversight board with the community. As the meeting adjourned, Jackson felt a sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, but they had made the first step toward a Cedarville where every citizen, regardless of race or status, could feel secure in their community. A few days later, Jackson found himself standing backstage in Cedarville's Town Hall auditorium, preparing to address the community in a public forum. Word had spread quickly about the mayor's recent encounter with law enforcement, and the auditorium was packed. Concerned citizens, community leaders, activists, and local business owners filled the rows, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, hope, and skepticism. Jackson took a deep breath as he listened to the low hum of conversation filling the room. Rachel approached him with a reassuring smile. "They're ready for you, Mayor Lewis. Just remember, you have the community's support." Jackson nodded, steeling himself. He knew this forum wasn't just about recounting his experience. It was a call to action, a moment to outline the changes Cedarville desperately needed. As he stepped onto the stage, the crowd quieted and all eyes turned toward him. He approached the podium, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the audience. Clearing his throat, he began. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm here not just as your mayor, but as a member of this community who experienced something unsettling last week. An experience that brought to light the issues many of you have been telling us about for years." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, some nodding and whispering to those beside them. Jackson continued, his voice growing stronger. "Last week I was pulled over, searched, and detained without cause. And while I walked away that night feeling anger and frustration, I realized that many of you face this treatment every day. That is not the Cedarville we want or deserve." The crowd responded with a mixture of applause and shouts of encouragement, their support fueling Jackson's resolve. "We are here to change that," he continued. "Tonight I'm presenting a plan for reform, one that starts with the police department but includes every one of us. Together, we will work toward a Cedarville that respects, protects, and serves all its citizens equally." Next to Jackson, Chief Bradley stepped forward to speak, his presence imposing but respectful. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "I'm here to assure you that the department is committed to addressing the concerns that have been raised. We've already started an internal review, and we're working with Mayor Lewis to implement these reforms." Bradley outlined a few of the initial changes: enhanced bias training for officers, a transparent disciplinary process for complaints, and a commitment to open dialogues with the community. His words were measured, a mix of formality and genuine concern. But it was clear that the crowd wanted more. They wanted to be heard. The floor was opened for public comments, and hands shot up throughout the room. The first to speak was Lisa Carter, a young activist who had been vocal about police accountability for years. She took the microphone, her tone steady but her expression serious. "I appreciate these steps, Mayor Lewis and Chief Bradley," she began. "But we need to know that this oversight board you're proposing won't just be a symbolic gesture. The board needs real authority to hold officers accountable, or else it's just a show." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Lisa. We agree. We're still drafting the specifics, but our goal is for this board to have genuine power to address complaints and ensure transparency." The next to speak was Tom Davis, a lifelong Cedarville resident who had witnessed many changes in the town over the decades. He had always supported the police, but recent incidents had shaken his confidence. "I've seen this town go through tough times," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "But this is the first time I've seen us come together like this. My concern is that we'll start strong but lose momentum. How do we ensure this doesn't just become another forgotten initiative?" Jackson appreciated Tom's frankness. "Tom, I hear you, and I share your concern. This process won't be easy, and there will be challenges, but we're committed to regular updates, public forums, and reports so that the community can hold us accountable as well. Change will take time, but it's a promise we intend to keep." The comments continued, some supportive, others critical, all of them filled with raw honesty. Each voice revealed a unique facet of Cedarville's diverse community, their stories highlighting both the pain of past injustices and the hope for a better future. The forum served as a cathartic release for many, and Jackson could see how deeply the people wanted this change. As the forum drew to a close, Reverend Johnson, a respected pastor in the community, stood up to speak. His voice was calm, his words carrying a message of unity and hope. "We all want a safer, more just Cedarville. True change takes time, but if we remain committed to each other, we can make this town a place we're all proud to call home." Jackson felt a surge of hope at Reverend Johnson's words. The evening had been intense, but it had also been powerful. The people of Cedarville were ready to stand together for justice. This wasn't just about a single incident. It was a chance for real, lasting change. As Jackson left the stage, he knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was more determined than ever. With the support of his community, they would forge a new path forward for Cedarville. Following the public forum, Jackson's office became a hub of activity. Plans for reform were in full swing, and the mayor was working closely with Chief Bradley, the city council, and community representatives to turn the promises made at the forum into actionable steps. His resolve to create lasting change was stronger than ever, but he knew that collaboration was essential to build trust and secure real progress. A week later, Jackson sat down with Chief Bradley and a few city council members in a conference room. On the agenda were the specifics of the oversight board, expanded bias training, and creating an official procedure for handling citizen complaints. Chief Bradley cleared his throat, beginning the conversation. Mayor Lewis, we've reviewed the oversight board proposal. I think we're aligned on the importance of community input, but we need to set clear boundaries. A board like this can't interfere with active investigations, but can certainly play a role in post-investigation reviews and policy recommendations. Jackson nodded, appreciating Bradley's perspective. I agree, Chief. The Oversight Board isn't about meddling with investigations, but about providing transparency and accountability. We want a board that the community can trust, one that doesn't just give the appearance of change, but holds real authority in ensuring fairness. Councilwoman Ortiz, who had been a strong advocate for community involvement, spoke up next. To make sure this board is effective, we need a balanced selection of board members, respected community members, activists, and legal professionals. We want people who will approach this work seriously and objectively. Jackson made a note. Good point. We can open applications for the board and vet candidates carefully, with an eye toward both experience and dedication to the community. As they discussed the logistics, they moved on to the subject of bias training, a crucial piece of the reform initiative. Councilman Price, who had been quiet up to this point, chimed in. The training needs to go beyond a one-time event. For this to really stick, it should be ongoing and involve community members. Maybe we can bring in experts and even citizens who are willing to share their perspectives on how policing affects them. Chief Bradley nodded. We've reached out to Dr. Elena Martinez, who specializes in bias training and has experience working with law enforcement agencies across the country. She has a strong reputation for bringing about positive change. Jackson's face lit up at the suggestion. Excellent. Dr. Martinez could bring invaluable insights, and we could include local activists like Lisa Carter in the process. If officers see how real people in the community feel, it might have a lasting impact. With each topic, the group discussed concerns, proposed ideas, and developed strategies. They decided to establish regular evaluations for both the Oversight Board and the training programs. The team wanted measurable benchmarks, not just vague promises. Jackson insisted on quarterly public updates, a point that was met with unanimous agreement. Transparency, he reminded them, was the cornerstone of building public trust. The final topic on the agenda was the process for handling complaints. Previously, complaints had often gone through internal reviews only, with no transparency around the results. Now, with the community's faith in their government hanging in the balance, Jackson wanted a more transparent and impartial system. Let's develop a system where complaints aren't just reviewed internally, Jackson suggested. Maybe a small portion could go through a citizen review before final decisions are made. It would keep the process fair and accountable. Chief Bradley nodded thoughtfully. I think we can work that into the system. It would show people that we're serious about accountability, but we'll need to make sure it's balanced, so it doesn't interfere with our ability to respond to emergencies effectively. After hours of debate and collaboration, they had a working framework for each of the reform areas. The Oversight Board would operate with clearly defined powers, bias training would be regular and community involved, and the complaint process would be restructured to allow for citizen input. As the meeting wrapped up, Jackson looked around the room. feeling the weight of the task, but also a sense of pride. This was a monumental shift, one that wouldn't have been possible without every person at the table. This collaboration felt like a tangible step forward, and he was grateful for the collective commitment to change. "Thank you all," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're doing something important here. This is just the beginning, but I believe we're creating a foundation for a better Cedarville." The team dispersed, but the sense of purpose lingered. They had taken the first concrete steps toward a city where citizens felt safe and respected. For Jackson, the path was clearer than ever, and he was ready to tackle the challenges ahead with the support of both his council and his community. Bookmark. The following week marked the first day of the new bias training initiative for Cedarville's police department. Jackson arrived at the training facility early, accompanied by Rachel and a few of his team members, eager to observe the impact of the reforms they'd worked so hard to put in place. This day would serve as a critical milestone in their journey toward creating a police force that truly served and respected the community. Inside the facility, officers gathered in rows of chairs facing a large screen at the front of the room. The atmosphere was tense, yet charged with curiosity. Officers exchanged uncertain glances, many wondering how this training would differ from others they'd experienced. Some were veterans with decades of service, while others were new recruits, but all seemed aware that this session was more than a formality. Chief Bradley greeted Jackson as he entered. "Good morning, Mayor Lewis. We've got a full schedule ahead today. Dr. Martinez and a few guest speakers are set to lead the sessions." Jackson nodded, scanning the room. "Thank you, Chief. This is an important day for Cedarville. I appreciate everyone's willingness to be here and engage in this process." Moments later, Dr. Elena Martinez, the renowned bias training expert, took the stage, her demeanor calm but commanding. Known for her direct yet empathetic approach, she had worked with law enforcement across the country, bringing about genuine change in departments that struggled with similar issues. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Today, we're here to address an issue that isn't easy to talk about, but is essential to the work you do every day: understanding and addressing bias. This is about helping each of you to better serve the community and build stronger, trust-based relationships." The room fell silent, every officer attentive. Dr. Martinez launched into an engaging presentation on unconscious bias, explaining how it shapes perceptions and decisions in ways people might not even realize. Using research and real-world examples, she outlined the science behind bias, illustrating how ingrained perceptions can influence interactions even in subtle ways. As she spoke, Jackson observed the officers' reactions. Some were visibly engaged, nodding as they listened. Others appeared more guarded, crossing their arms or staring fixedly ahead, skepticism evident in their expressions. But as Dr. Martinez continued, even the skeptical ones seemed to soften, her words provoking reflection. The presentation moved into interactive role-playing scenarios, allowing officers to confront their biases directly. They were asked to respond to different community members in hypothetical situations, some involving routine stops and others high-stress scenarios. Officers took turns role-playing both as the law enforcement figure and as a civilian, giving them a chance to experience both perspectives. One officer, Collins, a seasoned veteran known for his no-nonsense attitude, volunteered first. Paired with Lisa Carter, the community activist, they enacted a scenario involving a routine traffic stop. Initially tense, the exercise soon evolved into a productive exchange, with both sides sharing their feelings and assumptions. By the end, Collins admitted that he'd never fully understood how unsettling a simple stop could feel to someone on the other end. Afterward, Jackson spoke briefly with Collins, who shared his impressions. "Mayor, I didn't think I needed this training, to be honest, but hearing from Lisa, it opened my eyes. We may wear the uniform, but we can't forget what it feels like to be in their shoes." Jackson appreciated Collins' honesty. "That's exactly why we're doing this, Officer Collins. It's not easy to change how we think, but it's necessary if we want to build a community based on trust." The next session was led by Maya Johnson, a local activist and leader in community outreach. She shared personal stories about interactions with law enforcement, both positive and negative, emphasizing how impactful, respectful communication could be. Her presence and candor resonated with the room, especially as she detailed the emotional toll of feeling unseen or unfairly treated. One of the younger officers raised his hand, his tone genuine. "Maya, how can we rebuild trust if people feel hesitant around us just because of our uniform?" Maya paused thoughtfully before responding. "Trust isn't built in a day, but every small act counts. When you show empathy and treat people fairly, word spreads. The community is watching, and they'll notice the officers who go out of their way to engage respectfully. Trust is something you earn over time." The final session focused on the revised disciplinary procedures and the new Civilian Oversight Board's role. Thomas Reed, a legal advisor, explained the disciplinary protocols that would now include community involvement. He emphasized transparency and accountability, ensuring that officers understood the standards they would be held to moving forward. By the day's end, Jackson felt a cautious sense of optimism. The training had sparked meaningful dialogue and introspection, a solid first step toward rebuilding the public's trust. As officers filed out of the room, some stopped to thank Jackson, Chief Bradley, and the speakers, voicing a newfound commitment to the city's mission of fairness and respect. Jackson left the facility with a deep sense of purpose, knowing the day had been an important milestone. It was only the beginning, but he felt the momentum of change taking hold in Cedarville. A month after the training sessions began, Cedarville's town hall was once again filled with residents for a public forum. Community members eagerly awaited updates on the reforms, their expressions reflecting a mixture of hope, curiosity, and, for some, a cautious skepticism. Jackson stood backstage, mentally reviewing the progress the city had made since the last forum. Beside him, Chief Bradley shuffled through notes, preparing to share the police department's strides toward change. As Jackson stepped up to the podium, a respectful hush fell over the crowd. He took a deep breath, ready to reaffirm his commitment to transparency and accountability. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight," he began, his voice carrying warmth and conviction. "As your mayor, I promise transparency, and tonight, I'm here to share the tangible progress we've made so far. Your voices have guided us every step of the way, and I want to ensure you see that this is not just talk. Change is happening." The audience remained attentive as Jackson continued. "Over the past few weeks, we've launched the first round of bias training and community engagement exercises for our police officers. We're seeing a strong response from officers who are committed to making a difference, and I'm pleased to report that we now have our Civilian Oversight Board in place, with a group of dedicated individuals ready to review and advise on matters of accountability." The crowd responded with a mix of applause and murmurs. Jackson felt a sense of pride seeing their engagement. He knew how critical their involvement was for these reforms to take root. Next, Chief Bradley approached the podium, nodding in acknowledgement of Jackson's words before turning his attention to the crowd. "Thank you, Mayor Lewis, and thank you all for being here," he began, his tone resolute. "As your chief of police, I want to personally assure you that our department is committed to the new standards we've set. These are not simply mandates to fulfill, they're principles we are working to weave into the very fabric of our department." He explained the procedural changes in handling complaints, emphasizing that they had increased transparency in each step. Under the new system, all citizen complaints will now go through both internal reviews and the Civilian Oversight Board, Bradley explained. This process will provide additional transparency, and it will allow us to address concerns in a fair and balanced way. As the floor opened for public comments, Lisa Carter, the activist who had been a consistent voice for police reform, took the microphone. Her tone was firm but measured. "I appreciate the progress, but we need to know how you're measuring success. Are there specific benchmarks or metrics we'll be able to see?" Jackson nodded, understanding the need for measurable results. "Absolutely, Lisa. We're creating regular reports that will include key metrics, such as reductions in citizen complaints, improvements in community engagement ratings, and data from ongoing officer evaluations. These reports will be available to the public every quarter. The audience seemed reassured, and as Lisa returned to her seat, another resident, Tom Davis, stood to speak. Tom's voice held the weight of years, his tone hopeful but cautious. "Mayor, Chief, I've seen too many good ideas fade over the years. How do we make sure this keeps going strong even if the next election brings new leadership?" Jackson appreciated Tom's question, understanding the concern. "Thank you, Tom. It's a fair question, and one I've thought about. These reforms aren't just policies. They're being built into the very structure of our city's administration. We've worked to make them part of Cedarville's official code, so even if leadership changes, the structure remains. And with the Civilian Oversight Board, the community itself will have a lasting say." The next speaker was a young man named Jordan, a recent college graduate who expressed frustration at past experiences with the police. "It's great to hear all this," he said, "but I've had friends who are still hesitant around officers. Even with these changes, what steps are being taken to bridge that gap?" Chief Bradley addressed Jordan's concern directly. "Building trust takes time, Jordan, but we're encouraging officers to get involved in more community events, to be visible and approachable in non-enforcement situations. Additionally, we're working on creating more positive spaces where officers and residents can interact without the tension of enforcement. It's not easy, but we're committed to it." Over the next hour, more community members spoke up, voicing support, questions, and even critiques. Each speaker's story brought a new layer of insight, reminding Jackson just how essential it was to keep this line of communication open. As the forum wrapped up, Reverend Johnson, the beloved community pastor, rose to give a closing thought. "We're on a path toward healing and unity. These changes may not solve everything overnight, but we're taking meaningful steps. Let's continue to come together with open hearts and minds. Cedarville has the chance to be a model of respect, justice, and compassion for all." Jackson felt a wave of gratitude and optimism as he stepped down from the stage. The journey was far from over, but tonight's forum had shown him that Cedarville was truly ready to commit to this shared vision. Bookmark, go back. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, Jackson and his team worked tirelessly to maintain the momentum of the reforms. As promised, they hosted regular community meetings to keep the public updated, encourage feedback, and discuss any issues that arose. Jackson believed that a reform process lacking continuous community input would ultimately falter. For him, it wasn't just about progress reports, it was about creating a consistent and open line of dialogue. One of the most significant steps they took was to organize smaller, neighborhood meetings in addition to the town hall forums. These gatherings provided a more intimate setting for residents to voice their concerns and share their thoughts. Held in local schools, churches, and community centers, the meetings allowed Jackson, Chief Bradley, and members of the Civilian Oversight Board to directly connect with residents in each neighborhood. During one of these meetings in Cedarville's Southside District, Jackson found himself listening to the story of a woman named Gloria, who shared a heartfelt account of an incident her son had faced with law enforcement the previous year. Though her son had been treated fairly by some officers, others had shown a lack of patience, and Gloria feared the consequences of similar incidents in the future. "Mayor Lewis, I appreciate what you're doing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need to know that our children will be safe. This needs to be more than a temporary promise. It has to be something we can count on." Jackson felt the weight of her words deeply. "Thank you for sharing that, Gloria. I understand how difficult it is to bring these issues to light, and I want you to know that I take your concerns to heart. This isn't a temporary fix. We're creating systems that we intend to last, to protect every family in Cedarville." As he spoke, Chief Bradley nodded, adding, "Gloria, our officers are being trained not just to enforce the law, but to understand and respect the lives they're impacting. And with the Oversight Board, any incident that doesn't meet those standards will be addressed fairly and transparently." The room seemed to relax slightly, with several attendees nodding in agreement. Each story shared was a reminder of the importance of staying connected to the community, especially the voices that often went unheard. Jackson saw how much this ongoing dialogue meant to people and how it was gradually rebuilding trust between the city and its citizens. In addition to these meetings, Jackson's team implemented online platforms where residents could anonymously report concerns or provide feedback on the reform initiatives. This approach helped bridge the gap for those who weren't comfortable speaking out in public meetings. Rachel, Jackson's assistant, helped organize the online submissions, compiling them into monthly reports that Jackson and the oversight board could review and address. One evening, while going through the latest report with Rachel, Jackson noticed several comments from younger residents, particularly around how police presence at events could feel intimidating rather than reassuring. "This is valuable insight," Jackson remarked, gesturing to the screen. "It's clear we need to approach community events with a lighter touch, more about engagement and less about enforcement." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly. Maybe we could encourage officers to participate in casual roles, volunteering, coaching, or just attending without uniforms. Show people that they're part of the community too, not just figures of authority." The suggestion struck a chord with Jackson, and he presented it to Chief Bradley during their next meeting. The chief was on board, agreeing that the community needed to see officers as people first. "I'll start with some of our neighborhood officers," Bradley said. "They're already familiar faces, so it'll be a natural way to ease into it." Over the next few months, the initiative began to take shape. Officers started showing up at local festivals, block parties, and even school events, interacting casually with residents. Many wore simple polo shirts with small department logos rather than their usual uniforms, a change that made a surprisingly big difference. Residents saw them volunteering alongside neighbors, playing with kids at community gatherings, and listening to people's stories without the barrier of authority. The impact was immediate. Stories began circulating about officers spending time with neighborhood kids, talking with elderly residents, and participating in community cleanups. Jackson knew the reform wasn't complete, but he saw the genuine connections forming, the small yet impactful ways these officers were reestablishing trust. As Cedarville entered the holiday season, Jackson felt a renewed hope. The changes weren't only happening on paper, they were taking root in the community's daily life. The road ahead still had challenges, but Jackson saw how a shared commitment to openness, empathy, and trust had begun to redefine Cedarville's future. This was the Cedarville he had envisioned, a community where people looked out for each other, where law enforcement was a part of the neighborhood fabric, not a separate force looming over it. And he was determined to keep pushing forward, confident that with every story shared, every voice heard, Cedarville was moving closer to true unity. As the new year dawned over Cedarville, Jackson felt a deep sense of optimism. The months of hard work, open dialogue, and steady commitment to reform were beginning to show results. Cedarville's residents were starting to see a police force more connected with its community, one that was visibly changing its approach to foster trust and respect. For Jackson, each small victory reaffirmed that real, lasting change was possible. One crisp January morning, Jackson received an invitation from the principal of Cedarville High School, inviting him and Chief Bradley to speak at an assembly for the students. The school's staff had noticed a change in how students viewed the police and wanted to continue the positive momentum. Jackson was thrilled. This was a unique opportunity to reach the young people of Cedarville, many of whom had grown up wary of authority figures. The auditorium was filled with students, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Jackson began by speaking about the recent reforms and the new role the police department was playing in the community. He kept his tone honest and direct, emphasizing that change was something that took work and that they were all part of making it happen. "I want each of you to know that your voices matter," he said, his gaze sweeping across the sea of young faces. "What we're building here isn't just about laws and policies. It's about creating a Cedarville that respects everyone, that makes every single one of you feel safe and valued." Chief Bradley then took the podium, his words steady and thoughtful. "We know we haven't always gotten things right," he acknowledged, "but we're committed to learning and doing better. Our job is to serve and protect, but that starts with listening and understanding. After the speeches, the students were invited to ask questions. One senior, a tall girl with an athletic build, raised her hand. "How do we know this isn't just another round of promises that'll fade when things go back to normal?" Jackson smiled, understanding her skepticism. "Great question. That's why we're building these reforms into the city's foundation, so they're not tied to any one leader or administration. The oversight board is here to keep us in check, and you all have a say in how this city runs. I want to be held accountable, and so does Chief Bradley." Another student asked about how they could become involved in the reform process. Jackson's heart lifted at the question. "We need young people like you, people who have fresh perspectives, who understand what the future needs. Volunteer with the Oversight Board, attend city meetings, speak up about what you'd like to see. Cedarville isn't just for those of us leading now, it's for you and everyone who comes after." As they left the school, Jackson and Bradley felt a renewed commitment. The conversations with students reminded them that Cedarville's future lay in the hands of these young residents, and it was essential to keep them engaged. In the weeks that followed, Cedarville continued its journey toward unity. Reports from the Oversight Board showed a steady decline in citizen complaints and an increase in positive community interactions with the police. Officers were spending more time in community spaces, not just enforcing laws, but joining neighborhood initiatives, mentoring young people, and listening to residents' needs. Jackson began seeing the changes firsthand in places as simple as the local grocery store or the city park. Citizens stopped him to share stories of officers helping them or simply being present at local events in a friendly, approachable way. Even skeptics in the community were slowly acknowledging the difference these changes were making. One Sunday evening, Jackson attended a small community gathering at the Cedarville Recreation Center. As he mingled with residents, he noticed Officer Collins, the veteran officer from the training, chatting with a group of teenagers. They laughed and joked, and Jackson realized Collins was listening to the teens' ideas for improving the local skate park. Seeing this interaction filled Jackson with pride. This was the Cedarville he had dreamed of, a town where officers were not just enforcers but allies, where leaders were accessible, and every resident felt empowered to shape their community. As the evening drew to a close, Reverend Johnson, who had been instrumental in encouraging unity, offered a closing prayer for continued progress and cooperation in the community. Jackson felt the Reverend's words echo in his heart, a fitting end to a day that symbolized Cedarville's journey. Driving home, Jackson reflected on how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, but the people of Cedarville had chosen to confront them together with honesty, respect, and unwavering commitment. The work of reform wasn't finished, but Jackson was confident that they had built a foundation that would last. The lights of Cedarville shimmered in the distance, and Jackson felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had helped create something lasting, a community built on trust, respect, and shared responsibility. And as he drove into the heart of his beloved town, he knew that Cedarville's best days were still to come. This story highlights the power of resilience and community-driven change. Through Mayor Jackson Lewis's journey, we see how deeply rooted issues like bias and mistrust can be transformed when people are willing to confront hard truths and work together for reform. Jackson's dedication to accountability, transparency, and empathy redefined Cedarville's future, turning a moment of personal injustice into a movement for collective progress. The story underscores an important message. Real change is possible when communities come together, actively engage in difficult conversations, and commit to making a difference. From the police department's commitment to new standards to the community's unwavering involvement, Cedarville's journey reminds us that every voice matters. By fostering trust and openness, we can build safer, fairer communities that work for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, type 1 in the comments. If you thought it was amazing, type 2. And don't hesitate to share your own stories with us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more inspiring stories to come. Share your thoughts on this journey of change in the comments below.